Professor Thomas Fuchs. This is not the first time he tries to arrive to Pamplona. Some months ago, he was invited by our project. He is a member of our project of the ICS Biology and Subjectivity, and by the CRYF, the Grupo Interdisciplinar Ciencia, Razón y Fe. But the weather made it impossible. Professor Fuchs is Karl Jaspers Professor für philosophische Grundlagen der Psychiatrie und Psychotherapie. He said me yesterday that he is very honored to have a chair with this name, the name of Karl Jaspers, a philosopher with a medical background. He has habilitation in philosophy and in medicine, in psychiatry. Yesterday I made efforts to say psychiatry in a right way, but it's perhaps impossible. And he's the director of the section of phenomenological psychopathology and psychotherapy, and co-director, this is incredible, I have this in German, but a co-director of interdisciplinary forum, biomedicine and science of cultural science, Wissenschaft, and coordinator of a research training network, Marie Curie Research Training Network, Disorders and Coherence of the Embodied Self, and coordinator of other projects, the brain as an organ of relation. He has published several books. Two recent books are one, Das Gehirn, ein Beziehungsorgan, the brain, an organ of relations. This is related to the topic he is going to present today. And Leib und Lebenswelt, neue philosophisch-psychiatrische Essays. Well, body and the world of life.
Life word.
Life word. Okay. And he has published several papers about, I read some of the titles so you can see his interests. Fragmented selves, temporality and identity in borderline personality disorder, psychotherapy of the lived space, a phenomenological and ecological concept, the temporal structure of intentionality and its disturbance in schizophrenia, ethical issues in neuroscience, delusional mood and delusional perception, implicit and explicit temporality, and so on. And the word is to you. The talk, the title of the talk is Mind, Brain and Life, a Phenomenological View on Embodied Cognitive Neuroscience. The talk is 1 hour.
Yeah, something like that. Thank you very much, Professor Murillo. Thank you for coming to this lecture, and I'm quite honored to be part of this project, which is going to be a most interesting possibility of cooperation for our university as well. So thank you very much for inviting me. Well, you see the title of my talk, and I'm going right into the matter now. Until today, cognitive neuroscience has been mainly driven by the idea that by analyzing a single brain, one can best understand the human mind. And consequently, subjectivity has been regarded as a byproduct of the brain's activity as a symbol manipulating machine. And this view, however, separates the brain from the living body and from the body's interactions with others. As a consequence, mind and world are also treated separate from each other, with the outside world only mirrored by the mind, which is thought of as a representational system inside the head. This has brought about rather abstract models of the mind as a disembodied and cultureless symbol system in the brain of a solitary individual. In contrast, I will argue that this kind of neurobiological reductionism is by no means inevitable. It may be countered by an extended, or as I also call it, ecological view of mind and brain. According to this view, the mind is not in the brain, which means the mind is not located in any one place, but is rather distributed among the brain, the body, and the environment. In order to explicate this statement, I quote 19th century philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach. Perhaps you're surprised to read his quotation, but even being a materialist, he was not a reductionist, as you can see. What he's writing is that it is neither the soul, so the Cartesian soul of that time, it is neither the soul that thinks and senses, nor the brain. For the brain as such is a physiological abstraction, an organ cut out from the totality of the skull, the face, the body as a whole. The brain is only an organ of the mind as long as it is connected to a human head and body. And to this I would only add to the human body that is connected to its environment and to other embodied human beings. With this addition, the quotation here basically captures the essence of my talk. My argument will take the following course. Present cognitive neuroscience regards the mind as somehow localized in, caused by, or identifiable with the brain. However, this short circuit, as I call it, between mind and brain leads to a conceptual impasse, for it misses the essentially embodied, relational, and biographical character of the human mind. And to find out our way out of this impasse, we have to overcome the dualism of mind and brain by taking into account the phenomenon of life, including the organism, the lived body, and the life world in which both mind and brain are embedded. And this leads to my main thesis. The individual mind is not confined within the head, but extends throughout the living body and includes the world beyond the membrane of the organism, in particular the interpersonal world of self and other. And this is also the world in which mind and brain are essentially formed. In other words, human subjectivity is embodied, not embrained. The brain is a central organ of the conscious living being, but it is only an organ, not the seat of the mind. It is a mediator, not a creator of conscious experience. This mediating role of the brain becomes all the more obvious if we look at it not only cross-sectionally, but include the developmental aspect. The structures of lived experience are inherently mental. That means they include spatial, temporal, logical, symbolical, and other patterns, which in the course of organism-environment interactions are extracted and ingrained in brain structures. They are taken over, translated, so to speak, into microstructures of the brain. And this results in the formation of neural networks which serve as dispositions for meaningful relations and reactions to similar situations in the future. Thus we may say the mind in fact uses the brain. From early childhood on, it comes to be imprinted in the brain's structure. And the individual increasingly shapes his own brain through his actions and interactions. So the brain may also be regarded as a matrix that transforms all experience into lasting dispositions of behavior and of experience. It constitutes a system of open loops, so to speak, that have been formed in the course of earlier interactions and that are functionally closed each time when the organism is interacting with a certain object or a certain situation that it has encountered before. Now, with this introduction, I can go to the starting point of my argument, the mind-body divide, and the dual aspect theory which I will put forward. Cognitive neuroscience is still based on the principal divide shown here between the mental and the physical, or between the subjective mind and the objective body. The one is only accessible from within, so it is said, from a so-called first-person perspective, and the other is only accessible from without, from a third-person perspective. And thus, mind and world are also treated separate of each other. What is lost in the principal divide here is the human person, which is essentially a living being, an embodied subject. The person is neither pure subjectivity experienced from within, nor is it only a complex physiological system observed from without. It is a living being interacting with others from a second-person perspective, from a you perspective. However, present philosophy of mind is mainly based on the assumption of a profound difference between consciousness and biological life. Mind is conceived as purely internal and mental. Life is conceived as an external functional property of certain physical systems. And thus, the basis of the mind shrinks to the brain, and the body, with its sensors and actors, becomes a mere input-output device in the brain's service. And so there's no way to close the gap between mind and life. There's a short circuit of mind and brain, and this leads to the manifold vain attempts to overcome this Cartesian divide. The so-called hard problem of consciousness cannot be solved as long as mind and life are conceptualized in such a way that they, from the start, exclude one another. A possible way out of this impasse might be based on the notion of embodiment, which refers both to the embedding of mental processes in the living organism and to the origin of these processes in an organism's sensorimotor experience in its environment. The brain is primarily an organ of the living being, and only by this becomes an organ of the mind. For both life and mind are essentially related to what is beyond them. They are dependent on the continuous exchange with the environment. So just as respiration cannot be restricted to the lungs, but only functions in a systemic unity with the environment, so the individual mind cannot be restricted to the brain. The brain is for the mind what the lungs are for respiration. Consciousness is not a localizable object or state at all, but it is a process of relating to something. It is a perceiving of, remembering of, wishing for, aiming at, etc. And this dynamic and intentional character of consciousness is not covered by the concept of single mental events that could be translated into corresponding brain states. And therefore, the whole neurocognitive system cannot be understood separately either. It exists only embedded in the world in which we move and live with others through our bodily existence. And on that condition, a rational option seems to take a mixed approach, a dual aspect approach, shown here in this schema. A dual aspect approach to mind and brain which does not create an explanatory gap in an absolute sense. Because for this approach, the living organism, the living being, or in the case of human beings, the person, is the center, the common denominator, so to speak, which may be regarded under two aspects, from the left, from the right side. On the one hand, it may be regarded as a lived body, or a subject body. On the other hand, as a physical body, including the brain. So, in German language, we have the notion of Leib and Körper. If you look at me now, and if you hear me talking, if you hear me speaking, and see my gestures, you're looking at me, you're regarding me as a Leib, so living person. If you change your view, if you are a doctor, for example, a physician, and look at me from a point of view of medical, of anatomy, look in my eyes, for example, and my background of my eyes, then you change your view and regard me as an organic body, as a body object. So it's just a switch in the way of looking at, the switch of aspects. Now the first aspect corresponds to the first and second person perspective. That's our interaction here, our perspective here. The other aspect corresponds to the third person perspective, looking at something from an objectifying point of view, third person point of view. As you can see, now instead of a gap between two radically different ontologies, the mental and the physical, we have a duality of aspects within embodiment. You might say it's a Leib-Körper problem, so to speak. How is my Leib, what you're perceiving now, how is it related to my Körper, to my anatomical, physiological system? But both aspects refer to a common denominator, the living being. Of course, I only exist one time. I'm not combined by two separate systems or by two separate entities. So the Leib and the Körper finally coincide. The question is now about the relation between one's body as it is subjectively lived and one's body as an organism in the world. So instead of trying to identify brain states with mental states in such a way that the brain terms and the mind terms are obviously incommensurable, we should rather explore how brain states and conscious states each participate in dynamic, interactive processes that involve the whole organism. Having thus outlined some basic features of the embodied approach and what I call a dual aspect theory of life, I will now take a closer look at embodiment. There are three permanent modes of embodiment which form the basis of the human mind. There are cycles of organismic self-regulation. There are cycles of sensory-motor coupling between organism and environment. And there are cycles of intersubjective or interpersonal interaction. I will go through these cycles one after the other. Let us start with the cycles of organismic self-regulation, schematically shown here. Of course, as we know, the integrity of the entire organism depends on such regulatory cycles which involve brain and body at multiple levels. But organismic self-regulation also has a conscious and affective dimension. Affective neuroscience, particularly represented by Damasio or Jaak Panksepp, has emphasized the dependence of a background consciousness on this homeodynamic regulation of the whole body, mediated by brainstem and diencephalic structures such as thalamus, singular and insular cortices. Background consciousness means a feeling of being alive, a very basic self-affection, a core consciousness that lends a sense of mindness to all our experiences. So every conscious state is finally rooted in the homeodynamic regulation between brain and body. And in a sense, it integrates the present state of the organism as a whole. And thus, processes of life and processes of mind are inseparably linked. Similarly, all affects, moods, as the core of our subjective experience, are bound to this constant interaction between brain and body. Moods and emotions are states of the organism as a whole, involving nearly all subsystems: brain, autonomous nervous system, endocrine and immune system, heart, circulation, respiration, expressive muscular system. So each feeling, each affect is inseparably linked with a physiological alteration and the whole landscape of the body, so to speak. And only when these alterations are signaled to somatosensory areas in the brain, then feelings in the full sense may arise. So feelings are states of the living being as a whole. And this already makes it clear that the unity of brain and organism, which exists on the vegetative level, also reaches the higher brain functions. All conscious activities, such as perceiving, thinking, acting, are not based only on neural computations in the neocortex, as is often assumed, but also on the continuous vital and affective regulatory processes that involve the whole organism. Thus, the brain-centeredness of cognitive neuroscience is ultimately based on a Cartesian separation of mind and body that does not stand a systemic analysis of the organism. Neither consciousness nor the brain may be separated from the living body as a whole. Now apart from inner regulation, the main task of the nervous system is to mediate the sensory motor cycles that connect organism and environment, leading to embodied cognition and action. In the traditional view, a cognitive being's world is a pre-given external realm represented internally by the brain. But from an inactive point of view, organisms do not passively receive information from their environment, which they then transform into internal representations. On the contrary, organisms actively participate in the generation of meaning. Cognition implies a connection of perception and bodily action. What the organism senses is a function of how it moves, and how it moves is a function of what it senses. This is shown here in the sensory motor cycle. And it may be illustrated by a classical experiment which was carried out by Held and Hein in the 1960s. They investigated two groups of newborn kittens, which are, as is well known, born blind. And one group of the kittens was only carried around in their environment in a basket. The other group was able to move around in the same environment freely. Now, after 6 weeks, the first group was let out of the basket, but was incapable of any spatial perception and adequate movement, only stumbling around helplessly, while the other kittens had learned to perceive and move in space perfectly. What can we see here? Perceptual space is not a pre-given external container, but it is rather a working space that is molded, created by our sensing and moving bodies from undifferentiated visual stimuli. Space is something that we enact, so that we, even in perceiving, enact in a way that encompasses, that includes our moving bodies. Now, the inactive approach to cognition put forward by Varela and Thompson takes this generally. A cognitive being's world is not a pre-given external realm or container, which is represented internally by the brain, but it is a relational domain created by that being's agency and coupling with the environment. Or in other words, living beings enact their environment as inseparable from their own structure and actions. To illustrate this, let us look at perception from a representationalist point of view. There's an object out there, in this case a pair of pliers, whose features are transmitted to the retina, then further processed by the brain using an internal representation of the object. And once this internal representation is activated, a conscious percept is created, conscious representation of the object. Now, instead of this linear model, the inactive approach put forward, for example, by O'Regan and Noé, regards the object as being constituted through sensory-motor gestalt cycles. Perceptual experience is not an inner state of the brain, but it is a skillful activity constituted by the perceiver's practical knowledge of the object and of the way sensory stimulation varies with each movement. Take vision, for example, as is taken as an example here. When our eyes rotate, move, then the sensory stimulation on our retina shifts and distorts in precise ways. Similarly, when my body moves backwards and forwards and so on. In touching, when we touch things, the sensory motor dependencies are even more obvious. Moreover, objects are perceived as affording possible actions, being objects to deal with. They are objects ready to hand, in Heidegger's term, and this is obvious in the case of the pliers. Thus, the world is constituted for us in the course of a living interaction by the interconnection of perceptual and motor experiences. And in these interactions, the brain works as a mediating organ. It provides the open loops, so to speak, shown schematically here. It provides the open loops that are only closed to full functional cycles by complementary counterparts of the environment. Now, this idea is supported by the recent discovery of so-called canonical neurons in the premotor cortex. These canonical neurons are activated both when we deal with a tool and when we only look at the tool. That means, instead of inner maps or models, we are equipped with neural networks that underlie the complementary skills of perceptually interacting with objects. Neural states should be described not as mere correlates of mental states, but rather in terms of how they participate in dynamic sensory-motor patterns which involve the whole mobile and active organism. Perception evokes these action patterns, which are derived from earlier sensory-motor experiences. Or in other words, to know a thing and to recognize a thing is to know, and means primarily to know how to deal with it, how to interact with it. This applies for motor action as well. My actions are embodied. That means they are not somehow triggered by an inner mind, but they are enacted by me as an embodied subject. So when I'm writing a letter, for example, there is no point in the unity of my action where myself ends and the world begins. There is no border that separates inner and outer world.